Hello, everyone. Welcome. You are listening and watching Rashkin Report, as I call it, Perspectives, which is my English language channel, and Silicon Curtain, hosted by Jonathan Fink. And we are also welcoming a new guest to me and good friend of Jonathan. So, Jonathan, hello, and I'll let you introduce our guest.
Yes, absolutely. So, my dear friend here, DW Phillips, has been on the channel a number of times. We had the absolute pleasure of his presence on a recent live stream, which I know you were on as well, Yuri, but slightly earlier in the day. DW is a documentary filmmaker, an attorney, I think that right,
Yes.
and has a grounding in constitutional law, and is a huge advocate for Ukraine for various reasons. I'll let him explain. He's also very much involved in advocating an absolutely brilliant film, Kiev of Mine, which many viewers of my channel will be aware of. We did an interview with the I think director is the wrong word, isn't it? Really the sort of the brains behind it and the main activist behind it. But yeah, I'll stop there and I'll let you say a few words, and then we'll dive in.
Hey, Jonathan, Yuri, so nice to see both of you guys. Well, first of all, I'm a friend of Jonathan. That's a big credential I have. I'm very happy about that. I am a constitutional attorney. Uh, Recently, my life has been very dedicated. Well, recently, for years now, my life has been dedicated to filmmaking and journalism, especially, and focused on Ukraine. Ever since the full-scale invasion, I felt deeply moved to communicate through film and journalism that this is the defining legal, ethical, moral, geopolitical crisis of our generation, that it must be addressed. And the angles I take are not merely about the rule of law, which is a very important part of it, but are also about the humanity of what's taking place. I agree with the filmmakers. I'm executive producer of the film series Kiev of Mine, and our message is Ukraine needs a new conversation. Oh, yes, we still need to talk about the horrors, the difficulties, the pains that are taking place. But our emphasis with this film series is to show the humanity and to give the world a love letter, because Americans in the West have been very, very confused about what is Ukraine, who are Ukrainians. And that's what we try to do in our film series. And it's very entertaining. So all of those combine to bring us to where we are here today to talk about the, I would say, staggering, blinding, confusing events of the last week at the White House.
For sure. Yeah, we never even know if we have a White House, if it's been torn down by now, or what's going on. But yeah, I think that's a really great perspective that you're bringing to this, because um, my story, just to briefly kind of sum it up, because there may be some new listeners and viewers, is I was born in Mordor, as I say, in Moscow, in USSR, and I came to the US with my parents when I was 13, and um, got my education here, got a master's degree in mass communication here, and I'm a local elected official here where I live. I'm a court interpreter, Russian to English, English to Russian. No, I do not speak Ukrainian, is what I have to explain to every, not every, but many judges. And last year, and I've been involved with my YouTube channel, speaking in Russian a lot about American news and political news in America, giving more of a progressive liberal perspective, which makes me pretty much the only one. Well, I have a couple of friends in Russian English language space that bring not a super conservative point of view from another Russian who is telling you how we're going to crush you, and but a kind of a different perspective. And I find your point of view with the ethics approach to this is absolutely the right one, because I think we're dealing with a conflict, a geopolitical conflict between right and might. And I think that right can be might as well. And might can be right, but we're seeing American president who chooses he considers himself to be blessed because of how successful he is. And therefore he is in good shape because look at how well he is doing. It's almost like a prosperity gospel in reverse. But it's a weird situation. And so to think about things that are the right thing to do, regardless of whether it brings you necessarily profit or whatever, and it brings us to Ukraine, because they're there doing the right thing, standing up for all of us. And last year, when I, for the first time, went to Ukraine, I have to admit, that was really my first time, and that's what it kind of makes me curious about your series, because Ukraine has a great culture. Ukraine has a lot of interesting places. I went to Lviv and I went to Kiev, and just so much that I discovered being a Western tourist. That was so interesting, from the coffee culture onto everything else, and so I think that I look forward to seeing your Kiev of mine documentary, because I think that we do lose the point of Ukraine as being more than a war zone. And I kind of had actually a problem with a couple of interviews, at least one I remember that Zelensky gave to Fox News when he was sitting in this bombed out building. And I was like, yeah, just give him a trident or something, it just makes him look horrible, because I feel that Ukraine is so much more than a war zone. And so thank you.
Yuri, I think that one great point. And this film series that we've done, it's very unique. So I've been involved in a lot of television shows, a lot of films. I've made films for some time now. And this is the first time that a documentary series that I've seen, and the only one I know of in the Ukrainian war, actually began in 2018. That's when the camera started rolling. And it rolled because all the people behind the film fell in love with Kyiv as this incredibly exciting, modern, thrilling, beautiful city of love and light and technological innovation and fascinating people. And then we follow those same people year after year in real time, not looking backwards and asking them about what happened in the past, but with them on February 24th, 2022, as things are falling, and in the days that came after that. So it makes it very extraordinary to actually be with a chef, an artist, a pig farmer, an attorney, and others who are telling a very, very real story. It's absolutely crushing to the Borat-like Russian disinformation, which has propagated Hollywood and Washington, D.C., and the White House. And I'd say that's one of our motivations, is to create a love letter that gives a new story, a fresh narrative, and utterly annihilates this Borat-like perspective of Ukraine as a land of babushkas and gangsters, which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Because as you know, and Jonathan, I know you know this very well, and Yuri, you experienced this, I am safer in Kyiv and Lviv, except for Russians, than I am in Chicago or Washington, D.C., probably.
And this is an interesting angle. I wanted to bring two things that both of you said together here, and then this is more global and all-encompassing. What strikes me is the Ukrainians have been pushing back over a number of years, in fact decades, against not just corporatism, but sort of corporate gangsterism. The rule of oligarchs, where the media is parceled out and narratives are sort of fostered based on commercial interest, and indeed partisan political positions are very much warped by monetary interests as well. They've been going in the opposite direction by rolling that stuff back. They don't want a chief executive as their leader. They want a leader that's actually going to show empathy and reflect the broad interests of their populace, not sectional and, dare I say, even transactional interests. Whereas in the Western world, and of course, as usual, it seems the US is leading the way. But if the US, catches sneezes, we all catch a cold. So this is more of a global trend, and that is in the direction of shedding the idea that politicians and leaders are required, but that we need simple solutions and actually need to turn to a corporate executive to do it. Do away with the checks and balances. Do away with due legal process. We need fast decisions. We need, so it seems that Ukraine is swimming in the absolute opposite direction than we are, the right direction, I would argue, and we're going in the wrong direction. And all the other stuff is just kind of froth. All the rest is just sort of, sound and fury.
Fascinating insight. People will disagree. What was the greatest point in America? What made America great? And I would comment that despite the discussion about making America great, that greatness is never defined. If it's implied that it has to do with wealth and power. But what made America great was the projection of liberty. What made America great was the rule of law. What made America great was the belief that there were transcendent values which held a society together. And when we look at the presidents we think that had the, really powerful impact on the people of America, it was almost always because they projected a vision of freedom. So you think of Washington. If you read Washington, our first president, his communications are absolutely extraordinary in terms of how principled they were. The same was true of Teddy Roosevelt. I didn't always agree with Teddy Roosevelt, but I found him absolutely inspiring. I also didn't always agree with FDR, but during the Second World War, and often disagreed with him, but during the Second World War, he communicated a message which held the nation together. Both Republicans and Democrats will look back on the Kennedy administration and say, wow, there was a lot of vision there. There was a lot of hope there. And the same is also true with Reagan. Even Democrats today look back on Reagan and say, if only we had a president today that was communicating something other than transactional values, that was in fact communicating a love of liberty. That's what makes America great. Well, what does Zelensky do? Precisely that. And I realize he's controversial even within Ukraine, and many defenders of the Ukrainian cause have quibbles with him. But as an American on the outside, I watch Zelensky and I think he's always on point on message. And the message is always big picture. And that's something which every nation needs. And we do not presently have in America because our message is transactional, oftentimes in the worst way.
I think it's really interesting about the liberty in America, because we have this conversation in America, I feel, all the time about, is America in its essence a good thing and it's trying to be good? Or is this, like, I don't know, a racist past that always like seems to raise its ugly head, and we're a racist country, and that's really what we're about? And I think that this conversation seems to change depending on who's in charge, because I feel like if we have Barack Obama in charge, then we've been like going a very long way towards this amazing point where we elected an African American as president. But if we look at this as Donald Trump as the end point of where we are today, then I go, whoa, that's a very different of America, the kind of history that, considering the point where we have arrived. So I think that's just an important distinction, that leadership really matters. And the point that we're in right now is quite amazing, because we're just looking at a president who is willing to, on one hand, to rule without paying attention to Congress, but on the other hand, seems to be really concerned about the time factor. And that's something that I wanted to bring up, because I feel like we passed the Nobel Peace Prize. We passed, and yet even the reason that Trump decided to hit Putin with sanctions, as aggressive and harsh in newsmaking as they are, it's because as I understood, if I heard him correctly, which is always a question for anybody, is that tomahawks were too long, because tomahawks are going to take 6 months to train people. We don't have that kind of time. We don't? What's going on? So I feel like there's just, we don't have all the information, and then we have to make things, put pieces together based on what we have, and then that's where citizen journalism, comes in.
I regret that Mark Root, who I appreciate very much, and who has done many, many good things, I regret that his commentary on the tomahawks reinforced President Trump's decision not to give those to Ukraine. I think that was a very big mistake. Even more powerful than the potency of these long-range, incredibly fast, very technically excellent missiles is the message of the missiles. So the message of the tomahawks is we're ready to strike deep inside Russia. Russia is not safe. Russia already knows it's not safe. And America is doing something we haven't done before, not like this. So I don't like the messaging, whether it's from Mr. Root or certainly not from the White House, to claim that, well, we just simply don't have time. You're correct. There's time. We may have more time than we wish we had right now, but what we need is constant, aggressive moving forward. And I think that was a setback, even though Every time they do something right, it's like a broken clock. It's right twice a day. Every time they do something right, I want to say this is right. I'm glad there were sanctions placed on the oil industry with Russia, and that already had a 5% impact, you know, almost immediately after it took place. So I'm glad for that. But we just have to keep pressing on all these fronts. And we feel like ping pong balls right now because even the people that did not agree with Ronald Reagan could say the Reagan doctrine. They knew there was a foreign policy doctrine. We do not have a foreign policy doctrine.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
Other than transactionalism,
No,
self-interest.
no. I believe it's called Monroe Doctrine. And Monroe Doctrine means that the Western Hemisphere is ours and you stay away. And so this is where Venezuela comes in, and this is where Colombia comes in, and this is where Ukraine goes away. And it's insane.
And Alaska and Greenland, possibly as well.
Well, the Monroe Doctrine was a deeply embedded part of our foreign policy for many years. I'm not even sure that President Trump knows the word Monroe Doctrine. I don't know that that's his actual motivation or belief, but that's a long-standing policy that America had in the past. What's really new today is this idea that we can gobble up other countries, or we can violate our own separation of powers and our constitutional principles of the rules of war to declare war on cartels. You don't declare war on cartels in a legal definition of war. You declare war on sovereign states. And so the entire approach that we've been taking today has been anti-legal, highly political, and I think very much geared for the publicity that we get from it. And it's for those of us that care about our Constitution, and I've spent my life caring about the Constitution, it's mind-numbing in terms of how frustrating it is watching on the outside, because we're making advancements against the rule of law that no president has made before. We have rule by executive order. We have a complete absence of the Republicans. And by the way, there are Republicans who know better. There are Republicans who know this is wrong, but they are, I would say, for whatever reason, unwilling to speak out against it and to hold the president to account, with a few exceptions from time.
A few exceptions. Don Bacon is one fantastic voice,
and great comments from him this week, by the way.
You know, and I think that's why it's not about liberty so much, kind of continuing with what I was kind of wondering about before, because it sounds really nice that we're about projection of liberty, but I think what we're about is like what you do, DW. It's about law, that we have a legal system that used to be kind of predictable. And that's why people wanted to spend money here and invest money here. And that's why money wanted to be here, because it felt protected. And now, because of the lawlessness that we're experiencing, I can only imagine how attorneys feel, knowing that something that they've considered to be sacrosanct is hardly sacrosanct anymore. And I think that's what we're losing, and that's what we need to remember, that this is what makes us the desirable place to be.
It's a quick jump in there and sort of add my own little layer on there for DW. We've got law, but it struck me over the last couple of years, and this after many years of being in Russia and observing it, it strikes me that law is given more weight, intrinsic weight, than it deserves, because without the culture of observance, without the culture of respect and deference for law, it's just sort of words on a piece of paper. Isn't the problem here not just riding roughshod over law? It is also the abdication of power by those who theoretically could wield it. So that could be Congress, that could be the various institutions, the checks and balances that are supposed to hold the executive to account. They've abdicated responsibility, the same as CEOs of corporate America. This is abeyance in advance. Law is not going to protect us if there isn't a culture of struggling and fighting to, well, not just exert law, but to actually, demonstrate that you have power.
Wow, is that significant? It's interesting, Jonathan. My father essentially was a cabinet secretary in a Republican administration. I was a presidential appointee in a Republican administration. Both of us left the Republican Party. And my dad very very ceremoniously left the Republican Party, and this was one of his main arguments, was that Republicans are not, and we're seeing this now more than we ever have before, they're not doing their jobs by holding the leadership accountable, by doing what they have been empowered to do, what they are supposed to do. And it was our founding fathers who pointed out very famously that our system is great, but it only works for immoral people who are responsible. Our system is wonderful, but the system itself, the structure itself, is not going to preserve liberty unless that lives within the heart of people who believe that there are ideas, concepts, and values which must be defended. In other words, it has to be in our hearts. And when I look at America, I was on with Starsky last night, and a question was asked, and he said, like, well, what can Americans learn from Ukraine? And I said, well, one thing we can learn from Ukraine is finding their identity. America is losing ours. Ukraine is reinforcing their identity, and their identity is based on ideas and concepts and values which are both ancient and modern, and which are, I'd say, quite praiseworthy. There's more to go. It's going to be quite a melee after victory as we try to rebuild the new Ukraine, and we see what happens there. But Americans oftentimes couldn't even tell you what the Declaration of Independence is about. And by the way, there are 27 articles in the Declaration of Independence as to why America had to separate from Britain. 7 of those are expressly about the rule of law, and the others are about the rule of law by implication. But all of them are based on the idea that value, liberty, worth, and right is something which is transcendent. And when Americans believe that and they act upon that, we are at our best. And when we don't, we tend to be at our worst. That brings us to where we are today.
And the other aspect of, sorry, just before in my scrambled brain, before I forget my question, we've got the No Kings protest, but this also seems to me something that is intrinsic here. You have law on the one hand, but law is an expression, as it were, of culture, or the two have to exist. In talking to Ukrainians, it's not just phrases on a piece of paper. The idea of no kings and no tyrants lives in the heart and mind of almost every Ukrainian I've spoken to. It's almost like a sort of an absolute allergy to being told what to do, or to turning leaders of any sort into icons. And that may mean people you fundamentally agree with. Now, this isn't a non-partisan point, because there's a tendency on both left and right to substitute leadership for almost idolatry, to turn your leaders into these sort of unquestioning figures. That's we've got to get back from that, because that form of leader worship, I think, is one of the primary slippery slopes that we have gone down.
100%, and it's fueled by tribalism. Americans have become hateful. We're hateful towards each other, and so incredibly tribal that we hate our enemies more than we love truth. We hate the people on the other side more than we love freedom. And the result is that we accept essentially whoever comes into power. It's honestly, I know that these parallels are overdone. You have to be careful with them. But that spirit that was there in the 1930s in Germany of just solve our problem and get rid of the bad guys, we see it here. And it's troubling. We should be afraid of that.
Well, I think populism has its appeal to people who lack the educational and critical thinking skills to be able to ask questions, to go, really, is this really a simple solution that's going to fix all of our complex problems? But I think that you're bringing up a really interesting point. First of all, about the enforcement. I think that, yes, the law is as good as it is enforced. I agree 100%. And abdication of our institutes is what makes me feel like, people, when I communicate with viewers in Ukraine who go, where are the nurses? Where's the nursing staff that's going to grab this guy and drag him out and be like, you are just not fit to be here? This was, again, Obama said it, but it still remains true that he's not fit to be president. But we have a total failure of our nursing staff to relieve us of this patient, who is also our main doctor. So we've got a problem there of enforcement. And that leads me to question of identity, which I think is really crucial. And that's something that Vitaly Portnikov, with whom I almost feel like blessed to communicate. We do streams once every couple of weeks on my channel and on his channel. And obviously, a question of Ukrainian identity is one that's central to his work and to some of the contributions that he's made to Ukrainian culture. And I think part of an identity is just what we reject. What what we're seeing Republicans develop and Democrats develop identity of I am not a Republican, I am not a Democrat. And what really helped Ukrainians is to develop an identity that they're not Russians, that they're not with Putin. So I think what we could use is, first of all, we're not Russians. We need to just remind ourselves of that to begin with. And then just to think of the values that we espouse that are important to us, and to focus more on identity building for America involves with discovering that we need to have trust in ourselves, because we're experiencing things that people have had talked about in Nazi Germany, such as a spiral of silence, when people are afraid to speak up. And I think part of our Ukrainian identity is speaking up and speaking out and expressing their point of view. So I think we need that, a little bit of that virus of freedom loving that we had 250 years ago with the revolution. But over years, it turned out that it's really nice to have nice things and not to worry about things and to acquiesce rather than to fight. And then you get a little bit further, and then it seems to work out because, yes, we're led by nice and moral and mostly moral, decent people. But then we have a current administration who looks at administration of Eisenhower and says, oh, there were some nice things, like when they deported all those Mexicans. That was nice. When they they look at the worst thing that every administration has done and cherry pick that as something that they need to aim for. And this is how they build American history. So I think American identity needs to be developed yet. And part of it is growth through resistance. And it's right now it grows through, we are not Republicans or we're not Democrats, but we as Americans need to develop one joint identity, which could be developing through no kings parades, as we are not, we're not for kings. We're against kings. And I think that's part of American identity that really has to be in our DNA. And maybe that's why it's coming back so quickly, because we do, Jonathan, with all due respect, no kings, that seems to have been something that Americans really liked about ourselves for a long, long time. Although, when I hear jokes about, hey, maybe we should rejoin United Kingdom, seems like they're more sensible over there. It's almost kind of funny.
I'll take a slight exception there, because I have a long-standing position of being quite an extreme Republican here. I'm actually for the disbanding or the downgrading of the monarchy in a well thought out way. And I've always been bemused by the absolute fascination that many of my American relatives and friends have had with the royal family. And they'll ask me questions. Well, what about this? What about that? What about wills and die? And my response is, I don't give a flying shit. I honestly don't. I really couldn't care less. And unfortunately, the media is kind of obsessed with that as well. Just put them in a semi-detached house. If you really want, put a fly-on-the-wall camera. It'll make a nice kind of soap opera. But just let them be and let them go and live somewhere and do their thing. And let's stop paying attention to them. But there's a more serious point there, which is that it suggests that people haven't just woken up to latch those kind of obsessions onto Trump, that actually they've been lying nascent for some time. The sense that you need some kind of hierarchy, you need some kind of let's say royal pageantry or whatever. Unfortunately, it speaks to something sort of quite deep for those who perhaps don't have a sort of necessarily trust in institutions and secular institutions. They're looking for something a little more, let's say, colorful and simplistic.
Yes, and Donald provides all the entertainment. He is the bread and the circus. I don't know, he is everything, and it's kind of sad to think of how many videos of mine have his name in the title, because it's going to bring in the views and it's going to bring in the likes, and even though it's outrage. But I do think that actually my titles are less outrage driven and more like hope driven, like maybe something is going to happen. versus like, oh my God, can you believe how horrible they are? I mean, I know they're horrible, that what's news there. But with Trump, you never know. He can make news in both directions in 2 tweets.
Well, let's go to that, because we're obviously here for defeat of Putin, Russian imperialism, and the sort of triumph of Ukraine, and allowing it to carry on in its course. And there'll be reversals, of course, but it needs to kind of find its own way. We're seeing this extraordinary flip-flopping, which I don't think mainstream media is geared up to handle. They have a process of normalization and clickbaiting the news, which really doesn't work with Trumpism. But where are we? Is this a tussle between kings, between sort of Trump and Putin? Is it a tussle between people who would like to be friends given other circumstances, or at least on the Trump side, but they're still engaged in some rivalry or competition? Because every time there's a sort of, Trump does something that might benefit Ukraine, it's labeled as if, now he's getting behind Ukraine. Whereas I'm not sure he's ever been behind Ukraine or ever will be behind Ukraine, but there's lots of other stuff kind of going on, some of which might incidentally benefit Ukraine. Is that too cynical, DW?
No, I agree with that. I think that you're very much on point, that President Trump has never emotionally, practically, or even policy-wise communicated any sort of fundamental loyalty. America has agreements with Ukraine. If you looked at the White House webpage on January 20th of this year, when the president was taking his oath of office, there were multiple agreements. I'm not even just talking the Budapest, but I'm talking many things that America has. There's absolutely no sense of honoring or standing by those. And President Trump, while from time to time expressing some level of at least faux compassion, which is usually said like this: a lot of Russians are dying, a lot of Ukrainians are dying. It's bad for both. We feel bad for both people. I cannot think of a single example, except possibly the pivot he took in the last 3 weeks, the very brief pivot, where Trump has even articulated an understanding what's taking place here is one of the greatest criminal acts since the Third Reich and the Second World War by a sovereign state. We are dealing with people that are our natural friends and our allies. So I think the question you're raising is, are even these positive moves part of something else which is going on? I think the answer is absolutely yes. And that we should not speak about President Trump thinking of Ukraine as our friend or our ally, because he doesn't process it that way at all. Remember, who are the great allies of President Trump in this administration? Saudi Arabia, Qatar. Who does he want to have economic relationships with? Russia. And he says it over and over and over again.
Hungary as well. I mean, Hungary just doesn't make any sense whatsoever, because it's stop buying Russian oil, you naughty people. And then, but Viktor Orban, the one who is still buying Russian oil.
That's all about, that's 100% about Orban, and the sense that Orban is the MAGA leader of Hungary, and that they have solidarity and they have friendships. They don't know anything about Hungary. They don't realize that Hungary is at the bottom of the pile in terms of economic success in Europe right now, or that Orban is driving his nation into the ground. They don't understand those things. They just understand that he says a lot of great stuff about President Trump.
Well, and Donald Trump said that the main problem that Hungary has is that they're surrounded by dry land, which is an interesting problem to have. But that's their excuse for why they have that. They got to have the pipeline. I don't know. I don't think we're going to have kings, but I think that we have Argentinian bailout. I know that somebody suggested here in the comments, and thanks to everyone commenting and sharing this stream. And yes, this is a great panel. And I'm just trying to figure out how much more can we really sink into Argentina to help save that losing, because there's another leader who says Trump was great, and so now Trump invests into that. Maybe Zelensky needs to rename Ukraine Trumpland. Maybe then Trump will take some interest in it. But no, he's transactional, and I think ultimately Trump just wants to have good relations with Putin. I think if Putin called and said, Donald, I will go on a date with you. Let's go to Budapest. Then Donald could say, all right, I was kidding about those sanctions. I think that this can all be put on hold a couple of weeks. Let's see what happens. I mean, it's almost silly.
There's another part of all of this, Jonathan and Yuri, that we see that comes up a lot, and that is, who's the last person to have spoken with Trump? I have never seen a public leader who is so responsive to the latest flatterer or the latest person that they're in a meeting with since President Trump. It's almost like he switches on a dime depending on who he's spoken to, who the last person is. When he came back from meeting with the king and from England, that pivot he took was simply stunning and remarkable. But we also have to keep in mind that there's a lot going on here in the United States of America that's part of the complications that Trump is dealing with. Let's remember that MAGA is in the midst of a little mini division and revolution amongst itself. You have some of the most outspoken proponents of Donald Trump who are absolutely ticked off at him and who are dividing the movement. Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, they're angry about what took place in Iran. They're angry about Israel. They're angry. There's a very, very strong, shockingly strong anti-Semitic movement growing within the woke right in America. That's disgusting. And I never thought I would see it in my lifetime, ever. And it is horrifying, actually. And Trump isn't part of that. He's not part of that. There is, pressures. Bibi Netanyahu is a very confusing man to Trump and to the rest of the world. He wants to both maintain close ties with Israel, but at the same time, even there are limits to that. Sometimes it seems like. So Trump is dealing with internal divisions. And we haven't asked this question. If you'd like to get into this, we can. But what caused the pivot upon the pivot? What happened from we're going to Budapest to actually, I don't think Budapest is a good idea, and let's slap some sanctions on the oil industry? What happened? To me, it's actually predictable. It's not fundamentally meaningful, but it's very, very predictable. And if you want to go down that road, we can.
It seems pretty straightforward to me that the reason was that Putin is not showing enough interest in peace. He is not. He's stalling, and Trump doesn't seem to have the time to play along anymore. And I think that's why we're starting to see this Trump that is way more aggressive than, when he talked about 24 hours, anybody who paid attention and wasn't, I don't know, zombified knew that it was bunk and knew that this was never going to work. But he's still driven by the time factor. So I think that we shouldn't forget that.
And the time factor is interesting. And I know, the idea of Biden's cognitive decline was weaponized. The idea of Trump's cognitive decline is weaponized as well, and there's evidence, obviously, on both sides there. But let's take a sort of a slightly more telescopic view of this. He's old. He will pass. Same with Putin. Putin has already reached the kind of average age. I mean, rarely do Russian leaders or even men broadly actually reach the age that Putin has currently achieved. Both will die, and there will be a celebration in some quarters. But the key question here is, will Putinism outlive Putin? Will Trumpism outlive Trump?
Mm-hmm. Okay. This is a conversation that we should really be focusing on. I'm going to go back for just 1 second and just make a comment, and with Thanksgiving for the assessment of what happened to Trump. And I want to say that my personal view is that the reason why we're seeing sort of the quasi pivot upon the pivot of the pivot from Trump is that Trump was offended. He was offended because he went out and announced to the world that there was going to be a meeting in Budapest, and all of a sudden Peskov goes on national television and says, "Well, how can there be a meeting when we've never agreed to it?" And now the State Department of the White House is trying to deal with the fact that they look like absolute idiots. And Trump, I believe, responds tremendously to anger, pressure, mockery, things like that when he finally gets it. Okay, put that aside. What about the future? I think that Trumpism is going to self-destruct because it's unsustainable. It's like the French Revolution, okay? At the time of the French Revolution, everybody is coming together to hold these mock trials and to send the aristocrats to Madame Guillotine. But that only lasts so long. And pretty soon the revolution consumes itself and we start sending our own leaders to the guillotine. That's what happened then. I think it's what's going to happen here in America. J.D. Vance is never going to be president of the United States. It will not happen. It cannot happen. It must not happen. I don't think it's going to happen. There is no sort of heir apparent to MAGA, and MAGA was never a clearly articulable philosophy. MAGA was a reactionary, angry response to what was perceived as woke extremism on the part of the Biden administration and the mainstream media. There's no fundamental philosophy other than close the border, and we don't even know what we want to do with foreign policy. Trump has destroyed any sense that, well, we're against wars and we're for isolationism. He never actually believed that himself, but his adherents believe that, and they push that on him, and now all of that is imploding. The Epstein files are causing things to implode there. So something is going to happen. Will the Democrats step up? I don't know. Will Americans look for a third path? I'm not sure. All I can tell you is J.D. Vance will never be president of the United States. That is not going to happen. And
well,
I think
again, DW, I know this is not new information, but he's the vice president.
Yeah, I don't care. He's horrible, and I think that he's laughed at even amongst his own people. Right
He's backed
now,
by Elon Musk, though. I mean, as is Nigel Farage in the UK.
No.
It's not like he doesn't
Thomas
have
Robinson.
No, I don't know. I think there are a lot of reasons, and some of them might surprise you why he won't do it. I think, yeah.
So President Miller, perhaps President Bannon.
President.
I'm not even sure if America is ready. I'm not commenting on the legitimacy of this. I'm just pointing out when the time comes for him to run for president, Americans are going to even ask questions like this. The MAGA people who didn't care before are going to say, do we want a first lady who's a Hindu? We're not sure. Do we want this? Do we want that? I mean, there are going to be 1,000 questions that don't matter today that are going to matter. Was he really a Marine? What was it like for him to be a Marine? Oh, he was a correspondent Marine. Okay. There are going to be questions that did not matter to them before, which will all of a sudden matter. And his track record as vice president, which is a humiliation and embarrassment to the American people, will be highlighted. I think we'll be showing clips of him nonstop.
Aren't we living in a?
I think I see what you're saying. So if there's an election, if there's a fair election, there's no way that J.D. Vance would become president of the United States.
Yeah.
I don't see it.
I agree.
I don't think he
Miller
gets the nomination.
Yeah.
I don't think he gets the nomination.
Yeah, I think that he's got no charisma. He's got negative charisma.
Yeah.
He doesn't have any. Yeah, I agree with you there. My question is, if something happens debilitating to president and vice president's job is to take over, then he can
That's
really.
another story.
It's another story.
That's another story. Now, the fact that then he would be president for the duration of the term, but it's like a Gerald R. Ford situation where Ford became president. He was never voted on, as you know, because he was brought on as vice president in the middle of the administration, and he didn't make it around the next round. So I don't think the fact that he's an incumbent necessarily means he becomes president. I just don't see Americans voting for him. Now, a lot can happen in 2-3 years. We always have to remember that a lot can happen, but I don't see Mr. Vance improving in terms of his public relations skills or his position.
But
I would say a more interesting example could be candidates, could be Trump's children. If we're looking at actual heirs to the movement.
I think that anything is possible. We may see somebody else emerge, but anything that certainly is possible.
I mean, dare I say it, the most trenchant criticism of the current administration seems to be coming from Marjorie Taylor Greene at the moment. Someone's done something odd to her brain, and she's coming out with some pretty harsh and pointed criticism, which it's bizarre that seems to be holding them more to account or giving them more to worry about than the mandated opposition.
Although, notice, Marjorie Taylor Greene is the most unhinged member of the House of Representatives. Her background, which she acknowledges and admits, this is not a mystery or a point of controversy. No. Her background is in QAnon.
Absolutely.
She was a QAnon leader, a QAnon supporter. And the propensity of Marjorie Taylor Greene to believe that the moon is made of cheese is extraordinary. It has no limitations, no boundaries, and she's also quite vile in the way she handles things publicly. But what's happened to Marjorie Taylor Greene is a symptom of this division in MAGA that we spoke about earlier. Because when you bet all your cards on the one man that will reveal Epstein, that will stop wars, all of these different things, and he becomes the main proponent of it, you're stuck. Notice, however, what Marjorie Taylor Greene, her argument, and this is the same argument I heard Candace Owens bring the other day, and it's the same argument that Tucker Carlson is presently using, whose son Buckley Carlson is speechwriter to J.D. Vance, by the way, or is on his internal staff. Her argument is it isn't Trump so much as the bad advisors that are around him. They're trying to sort of save, even they are being very pusillanimous, because they're trying to save their reputation by being true to the values that they have been proclaiming, while at the same time not completely deep sixing the president, on whose reputation they have built their own careers.
Good Tsar, bad boyers. It's a playbook that's very much taken from the Russian hierarchy, and indeed the role of Marjorie Taylor Greene reminds me a little bit of those fanatical, communist revolutionaries who were pretty much the first against the wall when the revolution actually came.
I will just chime in on Marjorie Taylor Greene because I think she's showing a couple of interesting things. First of all, if she's QAnon, that means that she is infected with Russian propaganda. And totally. when we see her respond to Russian TikToks that are Russian propaganda, we see that it's probably she got there through QAnon. That makes a lot of sense. But I think that her bigger motivation at this point, politically speaking, maybe that she's thinking about running for Senate in Georgia. And she knows that being with her extreme fringe positions, even Trump wouldn't endorse her to run for Senate because he doesn't think she can win. So maybe she wants to show that she can, and she can have more range than they think. But it certainly is interesting because her range right now is showing her to be one of the signatories to the whatever is needed to go around to Johnson and to publicize, release the Epstein files. So it's a pretty strong move if she's doing it just for political reasons. And as far as boyars, the Congressman Massey did the same thing. When he talks about the Epstein list, he doesn't say that Trump did anything, but that there's other bad people. So it's very trying to, as much as possible, spare Trump himself, in part because I think his base loves Trump. And this is why the movement may have difficulty outliving its founder.
I don't believe it will. I don't believe it will outlive its founder. In fact, my own view is that
Messiah, I don't know.
I think that the midterm elections are going to tell us a lot. The results of those elections will have a direct impact on the next steps that Republicans and people within the MAGA movement take. I don't see MAGA as a movement because, again, it has no clear objectives other than shut down the border and go after the Biden administration people. And as you know, yesterday, President Trump announced
it's not enough for identity.
Yeah, no, it's not. Well, the identity is based on reaction and anger, and that does nothing other than create a mob. Mobs can be easily created by anger and outrage, but they cannot be sustained by anger and outrage. You need something more noble, more inspiring, more hopeful, and we don't have that. And these sort of illusory appeals to making America great, where there's no definition of what greatness is, that's not going to win in the long run. It'll only win in tossing out the people we don't presently like.
And there's a really good point made on the Bulwark, I think, with Tim Miller, I think is the guy who heads it. And he made the point that actually Trump has energized a whole bunch of the electorate to vote twice now, who would normally be far more passive and who may be unlikely to turn out for, even if they're ideologically aligned with the messages coming out from Vance, even if they like the incipient sort of racism and all the stuff that's sort of, as you say, pressing their buttons, they're just less likely to come out and physically put that, vote in the ballot for a different personality.
Well, Americans really want a gangster. I don't know. I just kind of think about it, because if this is the kind of person that can score points in our electoral political system, that means that there's a certain number of people that want a president gangster.
Jonathan, I don't have the demographics at my fingertips, but I've read them before. The amount of the American population that are, under the age of 35 that came out and voted for Trump. These are people that are highly motivated by the podcast world. Joe Rogan had a very big influence on young voters to come out and vote for Trump. And Rogan's decision to endorse Trump at the end was something we couldn't have predicted a year and a half ago, but it happened. And it had a big impact. I know a lot of people, young people, who decided to vote for Trump because their hero, Joe Rogan, said vote for Trump. So that's point number one. Point number two is that the people that are really rallying folks, what I call the woke right in the media, they are losing power, not gaining power. And one of the reasons why they're losing power, why Tucker Carlson is losing power, is because they become increasingly more crazy in the things that they're putting out there, and some people have paused. The second reason is because their strong affiliation with Trump is being called into question, and they themselves have to now criticize the people they laid their reputation down to get elected. So I actually believe that the woke right hit its zenith in November of 2024 in terms of its influence. Now it's still there. It's still powerful. They're speaking to young people. But the dynamic, I think, has changed and is going to continue to change. I do think we're going to have more opportunity in the future. The world will have more opportunity to sort of regroup. That requires leadership. It requires vision. I don't know who that person is or who that movement is at the moment.
DW, I think you did a really just fantastic job of expanding, because I felt like an answer, and then you explained how we got there, and it totally makes sense. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thanks to you as always for doing this stream, this panel. And if you want to say anything in closing, by all means.
No, I think this is so important to bring voices together, and it's why I sort of value the camaraderie of both of you. Is that we're coming from very different sources politically, but have such commonality in what we would define as core values. So I think it's a demonstration that we can engage in a dialogue in the things we disagree with, but actually find more commonality, but also focus on solutions and the way forward there. And I've learned a lot of this from Ukraine and studying Ukraine, and I've learned a lot of how not to do it from studying Russia for 35 years. So, but it's great to find people who can help bring together and orient around solutions rather than endlessly bemoaning grievance and despair and problems.
Slava Ukraini.
Slava.